The National Weather Service office in Denver recently admitted in an official government bulletin that they've run out of things to say about what they're seeing. Think about that. Professional meteorologists, people trained specifically to describe extreme weather, speechless. Parts of the Great Plains are currently drier than the Sahara Desert. 30 red flag warnings are burning across 6 states simultaneously. And here's the part that nobody is talking about loudly enough. El Niño hasn't even formed yet. This heat wave, this record-shattering, season-skipping, historically unprecedented heat wave is happening at the baseline. Stick around, because the worst part of this story hasn't even started. Subscribe and follow along, because this story has no ending yet. The heat will retreat, the warnings will lift, and then the Pacific will make its next move. The jet stream will lock again, and something new will arrive that makes this March look like a calibration run. When the next chapter opens, this channel is where you find out first, without the hype and without the noise. You are going to want to be here for that. Now, let's get into it. Something is wrong with March. Not wrong in the way weather is sometimes surprising, not wrong in the way a late cold snap catches you off guard. Wrong in a way that makes meteorologists stop mid-sentence and stare at their screens. Right now, in late March of 2026, temperature readings are coming in across the American West and Great Plains that don't belong to this month. They don't even belong to the month after it. Denver, Colorado, a city that on a normal late March day sits comfortably around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, has been pushing 90 degrees in March. That isn't a record being nudged. That's a record being picked up, carried across the room, and thrown out the window. The anomaly here isn't 1 or 2 degrees above average. We're talking 30 to 35 degrees above average in multiple regions simultaneously. To put that in human terms, imagine waking up one morning and the calendar says March. Your coat is still hanging by the door, and the air outside feels like the end of June. Your brain refuses it. Your body refuses it. And the atmosphere, apparently, doesn't care. What makes this particularly unsettling, and this is the part that separates a weird weather day from something that genuinely alarms scientists, is that these temperatures aren't just records for March. Some of the readings being reported across the Southwest and Rockies would hold up as records for April and May as well. The atmosphere has essentially skipped 2 seasons and decided to start negotiations with summer. In March. The National Weather Service office in Denver has been putting out statements about this pattern for days now, and you can actually feel the fatigue in the language. There's a line in one of their recent bulletins that stopped me cold. They wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there's only so much they can write about with the ongoing pattern. That's a government meteorology office essentially saying, we have run out of ways to describe this to you. When the scientists responsible for communicating weather hazards to the public are struggling to find new words, that's not a communication problem. That's a scale problem. What we're looking at is not a one-day spike. It's not a fluke afternoon where the thermometer ticks up and then retreats. This is a locked, persistent, multi-day system that has planted itself across a massive region and simply will not move. The Southwest, the Rockies, and the Great Plains are all cooking simultaneously, and the atmosphere that should still be slowly, gently winding down from winter and easing into spring is nowhere to be found. Here's why the timing matters so much. March sits in a transitional zone in the atmosphere. The jet stream is supposed to be shifting. The soil moisture is supposed to be carrying some winter memory. Temperatures are supposed to have a ceiling imposed by the sun's angle and the lingering cold of the season. Those guardrails aren't just bent right now. They appear to have been removed entirely. And the combination of extreme heat and extreme dryness arriving together this early, before the land has any defense mechanisms in place, is the thing that has fire agencies, hydrologists, and climate scientists watching this event with something that goes beyond professional interest. This is not an outlier that we can file away and forget. This is what a shifted baseline looks like when it expresses itself in real time. And here's the thought I want you to sit with as we go deeper into this. The system driving all of it. According to some researchers, it hasn't even fully activated yet. There is a difference between breaking a record and shattering one, and most people don't realize how meaningful that distinction actually is. When meteorologists talk about typical record-breaking events, the kind that happen every year somewhere, get a 2-paragraph mention in a local news segment and are promptly forgotten, they're usually talking about margins of 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. A city that normally peaks at 72 on a given date hits 75. That's a record. It gets logged. Life continues. The infrastructure doesn't notice. The ecosystem adjusts. The headline fades by Tuesday. That is the normal noise of a variable climate system doing what variable climate systems do. What is happening right now is not that. What is happening right now belongs to a different category entirely, and scientists have a name for it, though it doesn't roll off the tongue in a way that captures the horror of it. They call it an out-of-distribution event, meaning an event that sits so far outside the historical statistical range that the models we built to predict weather behavior were not really designed to anticipate it. The margins we're seeing in this heat wave, 15, 20, in some locations 30 degrees above average, don't just push past old records. They make the old records look like a different climate entirely. Because they were. Across the Southwest and into the Great Plains, weather stations that have been logging temperatures for decades are tying or exceeding marks set in some cases 50, 60, even 70 years ago, and doing so in March, when those records were themselves considered freakish anomalies for their time. Parts of the Southwest have pushed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit in March. The kind of heat you'd expect at the peak of summer is arriving before the daffodils have fully committed to blooming. And it's not happening in isolation. This is what scientists call record clustering. Multiple records falling simultaneously across a geographically enormous region. That matters because individual records can always be explained away. Any single station having a bad day statistically is unremarkable. But when dozens of stations across hundreds of thousands of square miles are all doing it at the same time, you are no longer looking at local weather noise. You are looking at a systemic event. A structural shift expressing itself across the entire system at once. The reason this should concern you, even if you live nowhere near the affected areas, is that our infrastructure, our agriculture, our power systems, our water management, our building codes, our emergency response frameworks, all of it was designed around historical norms. The records that are being broken right now were themselves the ceiling that engineers used when they ask questions like, how hot does it ever get here? What's the worst case we need to plan for? Those worst cases are being revised in real time, and we are not retrofitting our systems in real time to match. Attribution scientists, the researchers who study whether specific events can be linked to broader climate trends, are still doing their analysis on this one. The data is still coming in. The peer review process takes time. I want to be honest about that uncertainty. But here's the question that keeps surfacing anyway. If this is what the baseline produces, without the additional forcings that are known to be building in the Pacific Ocean, what exactly does the amplified version look like? To understand why this heat wave is so extreme, you have to understand the structure of the thing creating it, and it is genuinely elegant in a deeply unsettling way. The system responsible is what meteorologists call a heat dome, which sounds almost cozy until you understand the mechanism. A heat dome forms when a strong ridge of high-pressure air settles over a region and refuses to budge. High-pressure systems cause air to sink, and sinking air compresses and heats as it descends. Think of it like putting a lid on a pot, except The pot is the size of the American West, and the heat is just building with nowhere to go. What you end up with is a region that is essentially being roasted from above while simultaneously being cut off from any cooling system that might otherwise intervene. But this particular heat dome isn't just sitting there passively. It's connected to something larger in the upper atmosphere, a phenomenon called Rossby wave amplification. Rossby waves are massive, slow-moving undulations in the jet stream, the river of fast-moving air that circles the globe in the upper atmosphere and largely controls where our weather systems go. When Rossby waves amplify, the jet stream doesn't flow in a relatively straight line across the continent, the way it does under normal conditions. Instead, it buckles, bending sharply northward in some places and sharply southward in others, creating large, persistent lobes that allow air masses to travel to places they don't belong. Right now, there's a dramatic northward bulge in the jet stream across the western United States, and that bulge is acting like a highway for warm subtropical air to stream up into regions that, this time of year, should still have atmospheric cold, air acting as a natural barrier. That cold air is absent. The warm air has taken its place. And here's the critical part. The system is blocking. It is not moving east the way weather systems normally do in the mid-latitudes. It is stalled. It is locked. And every day it stays locked, the ground beneath it gets a little drier, a little hotter, and a little more capable of feeding back into the heat itself. That last part is important. Dry soil doesn't just passively absorb heat, it amplifies it. Under normal spring conditions, soil retains some moisture from winter precipitation and snowmelt, and that moisture provides a natural cooling mechanism through evaporation. Wet ground gives some of its heat back to the atmosphere as water vapor, moderating surface temperatures. Dry ground does not. It just absorbs solar radiation and re-radiates it as heat. Add in downslope winds, a phenomenon where air descends from higher elevations and warms further as it drops, and you have a system that is generating and reinforcing its own extremes through multiple simultaneous feedback loops. The comparison scientists keep reaching for is the Pacific Northwest Heat Dome of 2021. That catastrophic event that killed hundreds of people in Seattle, Portland, and British Columbia during late June and early July. The atmospheric structure is similar, but that event happened during the peak solar heating months of late summer. This one is happening in March, 2 months before the sun's angle even approaches its maximum intensity, which raises an uncomfortable question about what July might look like if the pattern persists, shifts, or, as some models suggest, amplifies. Because right now, above the surface of the land, something else is collapsing far faster than anyone expected. Temperature alone doesn't tell the full story of what's happening right now. Temperature is the headline number, the thing that gets the social media posts and the shocked expressions. But the thing that has fire managers and agricultural scientists genuinely losing sleep is what's happening to the moisture, or more precisely, what's happening to the complete and accelerating absence of it. Humidity levels across parts of the Great Plains have dropped to around 8%. 8. To give you a reference point, the Sahara Desert, the most iconic symbol of arid hostility on Earth, typically sits around 25% humidity. What is currently being recorded in parts of the American interior is not desert-like. It is, by this measure, drier than the desert. The air is not merely dry. It is aggressively, almost violently desiccating, pulling moisture from the soil, from vegetation, from living plants, from everything it touches. The mechanism behind this has a technical name that sounds far more boring than the reality: vapor pressure deficit. In simple terms, it's a measure of how thirsty the atmosphere is, the gap between how much moisture the air is actually holding and how much it could theoretically hold at a given temperature. Hot, dry air has an enormous vapor pressure deficit. It is perpetually hungry for moisture, and it takes that moisture from every available source: crops, grasslands, forests, bare soil, pulling it out faster than natural systems can replace it. When you combine 90-degree temperatures with 8% humidity, you aren't just making people uncomfortable. You are actively drying out the land at a rate that is difficult to overstate. This combination has triggered what scientists call flash drought conditions, a phenomenon that only entered the mainstream scientific vocabulary relatively recently because it was relatively rare. Flash droughts don't develop over months the way traditional droughts do, building slowly through a series of dry seasons. They develop over days to weeks, driven by the kind of rapid moisture depletion that extreme heat and vapor pressure deficit create. The soil moisture that should be providing some protection, some moderation, some buffer against this heat, it's disappearing rapidly. And as it disappears, the land loses its last natural defense against the temperature. The feedback loop tightens, and the fire risk moves from elevated to something harder to categorize. There's an agricultural dimension here too that tends to get lost in the fire weather headlines. Parts of the Great Plains are beginning their growing season right now. Winter wheat is in the ground. Some early crops have broken dormancy. The combination of extreme heat, low humidity, and rapidly depleting soil moisture is arriving at precisely the moment when plant systems are most vulnerable. Before roots have extended, before canopies have developed, before the natural resilience of a mature crop has had time to establish itself. The economic implications ripple outward quickly from there. But here's the thing, as alarming as the temperature and dryness numbers are on their own, they're almost secondary to what this combination of conditions actually enables. And what it unlocks is something we haven't even started talking about yet. More than 30 red flag warnings are currently active across 6 states. And if you're not familiar with what a red flag warning actually means, let me be precise about it, because the phrase sounds almost administrative until you understand the conditions it describes. A red flag warning is issued when 3 things converge simultaneously: low relative humidity, strong sustained winds, and critically dry fuel conditions on the ground. Any one of those factors elevates fire risk. 2 of them together create what fire behavior analysts call a rapid ignition environment. All 3 simultaneously across a region the size of what we're currently dealing with, that is the condition under which small fires become large fires in minutes. And large fires become catastrophic fires before suppression resources can meaningfully respond. Right now, all 3 are present across an enormous area. And that area is expanding. Here's what makes this March situation so uniquely dangerous. Fire season is not supposed to start until summer. I say that knowing it sounds almost naive at this point, but it reflects a genuine operational reality. Fire agencies budget their resources, position their equipment, coordinate their mutual aid agreements, and ramp up their staffing according to a seasonal calendar that has been refined over decades of historical fire behavior. That calendar says March is not fire season. The fuels on the ground, dormant grasses, dead vegetation from the previous year, the accumulated dry organic matter of a winter, those are supposed to still be relatively sheltered under some residual moisture from winter precipitation. Partially protected, not at ignition-ready conditions. They are at ignition-ready conditions right now. Wind gusts in the 30 to 40 mile per hour range are moving across grasslands where the humidity has fallen to single digits. Dormant winter grasses that haven't greened up yet are sitting on the surface like stacked paper, waiting. Fire behavior under these conditions doesn't follow the summer patterns that agencies have trained for. Fire moves faster than expected, changes direction with the wind, and resists containment efforts in ways that can surprise even experienced crews. The trend toward earlier fire seasons is not new. Researchers have been documenting a gradual creep in the start date of elevated fire risk conditions for years. But gradual trends and sudden extreme expressions of those trends are different problems with different response requirements. A gradual shift gives systems time to adapt. An extreme early season event like this one finds those systems mid-setup, not yet in position, not yet fully staffed, resources not yet pre-deployed to the regions at highest risk. And while everyone's attention is rightly on the flames that could come, something else is happening at higher elevations. Something quieter, but potentially even more consequential. High in the Rocky Mountains, something that took all winter to build is disappearing in days. The snowpack, and this is a phrase that sounds purely technical until you understand what it represents, is essentially a slow-release water storage system. Mountains accumulate snow through the winter months, locking precipitation in place at elevation, and then release it gradually through spring and early summer as temperatures warm. That gradual release feeds rivers, replenishes reservoirs, irrigates crops, and provides drinking water for tens of millions of people across the western United States. The snowpack isn't just weather, it is infrastructure. It is the foundation of the water economy of an entire region, and it is melting right now at a pace it was not supposed to reach until weeks from now. When snowpack melts on schedule, gently across several weeks, timed to align with the onset of the agricultural season and the gradual filling of downstream reservoirs, the system works. Water goes where it's needed, when it's needed. When snowpack melts in an abrupt, heat-driven surge, the timing falls apart in both directions simultaneously. The water arrives too early, moving through river systems before reservoirs have been drawn down enough to accept it, potentially causing flooding in downstream areas that are nowhere near fire risk. And then, critically, it doesn't arrive later, during the dry summer months when demand peaks and when that stored snowpack would normally be providing its most essential function. The agricultural implications alone are significant. Irrigation systems in the West are calibrated to a specific water timing. Farmers plan planting schedules around expected water availability. When the delivery curve shifts, everything arriving in a compressed early burst rather than a sustained seasonal release, those plans break down. You end up with a situation where there is technically enough water in the annual total, but the distribution across the season is so disrupted that it functions as a shortage for the periods when it matters most. Long term, the trend toward earlier snowmelt dates is one of the clearest and most consistently documented signals in Western climate data. The variability across different mountain ranges is real. Not every range is melting at the same rate or on the same timeline, but the direction is consistent. And an event like this one doesn't just advance this year's melt date. It deposits a data point so far outside the historical average that it will reshape the projections themselves. Somewhere in a hydrology department right now, someone is updating a model. While they do that, something is happening at ground level that is far harder to quantify and far stranger to witness. Nature doesn't read forecasts, and right now, that is a serious problem. Across the affected regions, the prolonged heat has done what heat does. It has triggered biological responses in plants and animals that evolved over millennia to interpret warm temperatures as a signal that spring has arrived and it is safe to begin the processes of growth, reproduction, and activity. Trees are beginning to bud. Some grasses are breaking dormancy. Early wildflowers in lower elevations are blooming ahead of schedule. Insects are emerging. And in a normally functioning year, this would be beautiful. This is, in fact, what spring is supposed to look like, just not in March, and not like this. The phenomenon is called false spring, and it is a specific kind of ecological trap that occurs when an early warm period triggers biological spring responses before the last hard frosts of winter have actually passed. Plants that have broken dormancy and pushed out new growth are particularly vulnerable. That tender new tissue has essentially zero cold tolerance. A single night below freezing after a false spring event can destroy weeks of biological investment in minutes. The cells that formed under warmth simply weren't designed to survive frost. Fruit orchards in the affected region are already at risk of exactly this scenario if temperatures drop again in April, as they historically do. The ecological concern goes beyond individual plant species. What biologists call phenology, the timing of cyclical biological events, is a synchronized system. Flowers bloom when their pollinators are active. Caterpillars emerge when the birds that feed them to their nestlings are nesting. Migrating species arrive when their food sources are at peak availability. All of these timings co-evolved over vast stretches of time, creating interlocking dependencies that generally hold within a certain range of variation. When conditions push events outside that range, those dependencies start to break. The pollinator problem is particularly well documented. Native bee populations, monarch butterflies, and dozens of other species have emergence timings that don't respond to temperature alone. They also respond to day length, which heat waves cannot change. A plant blooming 3 weeks early will not necessarily be met by a pollinator that is 3 weeks early, because that pollinator is waiting for a different signal. The flower opens. Nothing comes. The fruit doesn't set. This mismatch, repeated across enough species and enough years, degrades ecosystem function in ways that compound quietly until they become irreversible. Nature woke up too early this year, was tricked by the heat into thinking winter was over, and the bill for that mistake may not come due for weeks. Or it may come due when the next cold front sweeps through. But it will come. And while ecosystems scramble to adjust, the systems humans have built may be even less ready. Our civilization is built on the assumption that seasons happen in a predictable order, and nobody ever had to write that assumption down, because for the entire span of recorded human history, it was simply true. Power grids are the most immediate example. Electrical infrastructure in the United States is managed on a seasonal demand model. Winter demand peaks for heating. Summer demand peaks for cooling. And the in-between months, the March through May shoulder season, are when utilities perform maintenance, take generating units offline for inspection, and operate with reduced reserve margins because, historically, demand is low and predictable. Right now, in what should be the lowest demand period of the year, air conditioning loads are spiking across a multi-state region at a level that more closely resembles a July heat emergency than a spring afternoon. The grid was not positioned for this. It is not broken, but it is being tested in a way it was not designed to anticipate at this time of year. Urban heat islands are making everything worse. Cities, with their concrete and asphalt and the residual heat of human activity, already run several degrees warmer than surrounding rural areas. Add a baseline anomaly of 30 degrees above average, and those urban amplifications compound. People in cities are experiencing temperatures that rural weather stations aren't even recording. And the public health system, which typically runs heat emergency protocols during summer, is operating in spring mode, meaning cooling centers may not be open, heat illness awareness campaigns haven't started, and the reflexive community preparedness that kicks in during a July heatwave simply hasn't been activated. Water systems are under quiet pressure too. Elevated temperatures increase evaporation from reservoirs, increase agricultural water demand, and put stress on municipal supply systems that are already managing the mismatch from the accelerated snowmelt. Roads and rail infrastructure, which expand and contract with temperature, are experiencing thermal stress outside their typical seasonal range. These are minor effects individually. Collectively, they represent attacks on systems that were engineered for a world that increasingly doesn't exist. The deeper issue is institutional. Emergency management frameworks, building codes, infrastructure design standards, public health messaging systems, all of them encode assumptions about seasonal ranges derived from historical data. When the actual conditions fall outside those ranges, the frameworks become unreliable guides. They tell you what to expect and how to respond for a climate that existed in the past. They are less useful guides for for the one we're apparently already inhabiting. But everything we've talked about so far, as significant as it is really just the visible expression of a system whose true driver is located thousands of miles away, beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Here is the fact that stops climate scientists mid-conversation. The heat wave currently breaking records across the American West is happening without El Niño. Let me be precise about what that means, because it's easy to hear El Niño and file it under weather thing that affects news occasionally. El Niño is a periodic warming of surface waters in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean that fundamentally reorganizes atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire planet. It shifts storm tracks, alters monsoon timing, drives flooding in some regions and drought in others, and consistently produces some of the warmest years in the global temperature record when it coincides with the background trend of long-term warming. In strong El Niño years, we expect extremes. We plan for extremes. The models have some framework for understanding how the additional forcing will express itself. The Pacific right now is not in a strong El Niño state. The current period is better described as inso-neutral, or in some readings, in a transitional phase. The ocean surface is warm, but hasn't crossed the threshold that would technically qualify as El Niño, which means the extreme heat currently being recorded across the western United States is not being driven by that additional forcing. It's not riding on top of a Pacific heat boost. It is, to use the technical framing, a product of the elevated baseline, of background conditions, of where we are now, without additional help from the most powerful natural climate oscillation on Earth. Think about what that means. If this is the magnitude of anomaly the atmosphere can produce without El Niño, with Pacific conditions that are merely warm, not exceptionally warm, then adding a strong El Niño on top of this baseline is not a matter of simple addition. The relationship between large-scale forcings and extreme weather outcomes is not linear. Extremes compound in ways that are genuinely difficult to model and consistently harder to intuit. And the question of whether El Niño is coming, when it might arrive, and how strong it might get, that question is not settled. Because beneath the surface of the Pacific, something is accumulating that has researchers watching their monitoring buoys with an unusual level of attention. Below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, heat is building in a way that doesn't show up in the numbers most people look at. When you see Pacific sea surface temperature maps, the ones that make headlines and drive El Niño declarations, you're seeing the temperature of the uppermost layer of the ocean. But the ocean is not a thin membrane. It's a deep, complex, layered system, and the boundary between the warm surface layer and the cold, deep water, a zone called the thermocline, is where much of the interesting thermal dynamics actually occur. Right now, subsurface ocean temperature data, gathered from a network of monitoring buoys and instruments that most people have never heard of, shows anomalously warm water sitting below the Pacific surface across a significant portion of the equatorial band. Think of it the way you'd think about a dam holding back water. The energy is there. It's stored. It's building. But it hasn't yet reached the surface interface, where it would begin to meaningfully influence the atmosphere above it. The ocean and atmosphere interact in a complex, delayed feedback. Surface waters warm. They evaporate more moisture. They transfer heat to the overlying air. They alter wind patterns. Those altered wind patterns, in turn, reshape the ocean circulation that drives El Niño development. It takes time, months sometimes. But the heat that would fuel that process is present below the surface in quantities that have multiple research groups paying close attention. It's important to be honest about the scientific uncertainty here. Not every pool of subsurface warm water develops into a strong El Niño. The timing, the depth distribution, the interaction with stratospheric wind patterns, called the quasi-biennial oscillation, these factors all influence whether subsurface heat actually surfaces and drives atmospheric change, or whether it dissipates quietly without ever becoming a headline. ocean-atmosphere coupling is genuinely one of the harder forecasting problems in Earth science. The models have gotten better, but they remain imperfect guides to this specific question. What is less uncertain is the trend context, the baseline temperature of the Pacific, including its subsurface layers, is warmer now than at any comparable point in the instrumental record. The starting temperature for any El Niño that does develop is already elevated, and what happens when it finally surfaces might tell us something important about where the upper bound of extreme weather actually sits now. Because the scenario that emerges when you combine everything we know about current conditions with everything we know about what's building, that scenario has a name that scientists use quietly among themselves. In 2015 and 2016, the world experienced what was then the strongest El Niño on record. Global average temperatures that year hit levels that hadn't been seen in the modern instrumental record. Coral reefs bleached at unprecedented scale. Drought conditions in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America set records that still stand. And climate scientists, looking back at that event afterward, noted something that should have attracted more mainstream attention. The extremes of that period were not simply the result of El Niño. They were the result of El Niño sitting on top of an already elevated global temperature baseline, the two forcings combining to push outcomes into ranges that neither would have reached alone. We are now a decade past that event. The global baseline temperature is higher than it was in 2015. The Pacific Ocean is warmer at depth than it was in 2015. And there is a non-trivial possibility, based on the subsurface data, that a new El Niño, potentially a significant one, could develop in the next several months. What the scientific community calls a double forcing scenario is the combination of that cyclical El Niño push with the structural elevation of background warming conditions. And the behavior of this combination is not simply additive. In complex nonlinear systems, which is what the climate absolutely is, stacking forcings on top of elevated baselines tends to push extremes into tail regions that compound rather than add. The 2015-16 event is the best historical analogy we have, but it's an imperfect one for a specific reason. The baseline from which that event launched was lower than the baseline we're starting from now. When researchers try to model what a comparably strong El Niño event would produce in the current climate environment, the outputs push into ranges that are genuinely difficult to communicate without sounding alarmist, which creates a specific problem because the scientific caution that prevents overstating conclusions also has a tendency to produce understatements in the public-facing messaging. The uncertainty cuts in both directions. The event might not develop. The subsurface heat might not translate into a strong atmospheric signal. But if it does, if the Pacific delivers on what the subsurface data is suggesting, the current heat wave, historic as it is, might end up looking like a preview. And our ability to see that coming clearly runs directly into a problem that lives inside the tools we built to do exactly that. The most honest thing a climate scientist will tell you privately is that the models are better than they've ever been, and still not good enough for the thing we most need to know. Seasonal climate forecasting, predicting not just tomorrow's weather, but the character of the next 3 to 6 months, is one of the genuinely hard problems in Earth science. The challenge starts at initialization. You have to know the precise starting state of the atmosphere, the ocean surface, the ocean interior, the land surface, the snowpack, and several other components simultaneously, and feed all of that accurately into a coupled model that can then simulate how those components interact forward in time. Every imperfection in that starting state, and there are always imperfections, because the measurement network, as good as it is, doesn't cover the entire Earth at infinite resolution, propagates forward through the simulation, growing over time until the spread between model runs becomes large enough to swallow the signal you were trying to detect. There's a specific known limitation that's particularly relevant here. Climate models have historically struggled with extreme tail events. They capture trends well. They capture average changes in temperature and precipitation patterns reasonably well. But the tail of the distribution, the rare extreme events that fall far from the mean, is where models tend to underperform most consistently. There's ongoing scientific debate about whether this reflects fundamental limitations in how models represent certain physical processes, or whether it's an artifact of resolution and computational constraints that will improve as computing power increases, or both. The answer is probably both. The implications are uncomfortable either way. The events we most need to forecast accurately are precisely the events the models are least reliable at predicting. The ocean interior data gap is a real issue too. The Argo float network, thousands of autonomous instruments that drift through the ocean measuring temperature and salinity at depth, has transformed subsurface oceanography. But it's not uniform. Coverage in some regions is sparse. The measurements are intermittent. And ocean-atmosphere coupling, the feedback relationship between Pacific sea surface temperatures and the large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns that govern where storms go and where heat accumulates, that coupling remains one of the more stubborn sources of model uncertainty. We can see the trend. We can see the direction. What we cannot always see clearly is the magnitude of the spike when it comes. And the question of what's driving the pattern at a structural level, not just at the event level, reaches into a debate that sits at the intersection of atmospheric science, oceanography, and something a little more controversial. To understand why extreme weather events seem to be not just more intense, but more persistent, why they park in one location for longer, why blocking patterns are harder to break, you have to follow the science to a place that, a decade ago, was considered genuinely controversial and is now generating some of the most active research in atmospheric dynamics. The Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. This isn't a speculative projection anymore. It's an observed, measured, replicated fact. The Arctic is warming at roughly 3 to 4 times the rate of the global average, a phenomenon called Arctic amplification, and it has a specific consequence for the large-scale structure of the atmosphere. The jet stream, that river of fast-moving air in the upper atmosphere that I mentioned earlier, is fundamentally driven by the temperature difference between the warm tropics and the cold polar regions. The steeper that temperature gradient, the faster and more directed the jet stream flows. The shallower the gradient, which is what you get when the Arctic warms faster than the mid-latitudes, the more the jet stream tends to slow down and develop large amplified meanders. Those meanders, called Rossby waves, have always existed. The concern is not that they're a new feature. The concern is that when they amplify and slow down, they produce the exact conditions we're seeing right now, a blocking pattern that locks a ridge of high pressure over a region for an extended period, rather than allowing weather systems to move through on a normal west to east track. The evidence that this type of persistent blocking is becoming more common is real and growing, though the scientific debate about the mechanism, specifically about how much Arctic amplification is contributing versus other factors, remains active. The practical implication is not subtle. Instead of a weather system arriving, spending a few days, and moving on, you get a weather system that stalls, that builds, that has time to exhaust the soil moisture, to push temperatures further above the mean, to set up the secondary effects, the fire risk, the ecological disruption, the infrastructure stress that require days to develop fully. The jet stream, in other words, isn't just failing to moderate the extremes. It may actually be enabling them to sustain. And if the structure that's generating that persistence is itself a consequence of the changing temperature gradient between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes, then what we're watching isn't an anomaly in the usual sense. It's a symptom of a reorganization that's still in progress. And the reorganization may have consequences for something most people assume is essentially fixed: the seasons themselves. Seasons are not simply a function of the Earth's tilt relative to the sun. That tilt is what ultimately drives the energy distribution, yes, but the seasons as we experience them, as defined periods with characteristic weather patterns, are partly a product of atmospheric circulation structures that have been relatively stable for the length of human civilization. Those structures are beginning to change in ways that researchers are documenting with increasing confidence and discussing with increasing discomfort. The theoretical framework sometimes called seasonal collapse. And I want to be clear that this is still an emerging area of research, not a settled consensus position, suggests that the traditional four-season model is being replaced in many mid-latitude regions by something more like a two-season reality, with a compressed, chaotic transition between them. Winter gives way not to a gradual spring, but to sudden summer-like conditions. Fall arrives abruptly from summer heat. The shoulder seasons, those weeks of mild, gentle transition that human agriculture and ecosystems and construction calendars were all built around, are shrinking. They're being replaced by abrupt jumps that leave biological and human systems stranded between configurations. The evidence for this is observational more than theoretical at this point. Researchers analyzing temperature data going back decades across mid-latitude regions have documented an increase in what they informally call winter to summer jump events, periods where temperatures go from well below average to far above average with minimal transitional time. The current event in the American West is an extreme version of exactly that pattern. Denver went from normal late winter conditions to temperatures that rival the warmest summer days in the span of a week. That kind of abrupt transition generates all of the secondary effects we've been discussing: confused biology, unprepared infrastructure, fire conditions arriving without warning. And there's a structural element that makes this worse every time it happens, because these events don't just disrupt. They also set conditions for the next disruption. When a heat wave dries out the soil and depletes moisture from the landscape, the next heat event doesn't just inherit the base atmospheric conditions. It inherits a land surface that is already primed to amplify. Scientists studying the frequency of large-scale atmospheric ridging events, the kind of persistent high-pressure system currently baking the American West, have noticed something that doesn't appear in most news coverage of individual heat waves. These events are clustering. Not clustering in the sense of occurring in the same place. Clustering in the sense of occurring more frequently globally, with shorter recovery intervals between them. Where historical patterns might show a major blocking event, followed by weeks or months of relatively normal circulation before the next significant ridge developed, the observed trend in recent decades shows events stacking up more closely in time. The atmospheric circulation appears to be spending more time in the extreme ridge configuration and less time in the relatively moderate mobile configuration that breaks up heat buildup and allows systems to recover. This matters enormously for compound risk. Any single heat wave, however severe, is a recoverable event for most biological and human systems. Ecosystems have resilience. Soils rehydrate with rain. Snowpack rebuilds over winter. People and communities adapt between events. The recovery window is not infinite, but it exists, and it's what allows systems to absorb shocks without permanent degradation. When the intervals between events shrink, that recovery window compresses or disappears entirely. A forest that was already stressed from the previous summer's heat wave has less capacity to withstand this spring's fire conditions. An aquifer that was already running below normal from last year's drought has less buffer when this year's snowmelt fails to recharge it. The second event, arriving before full recovery from the first, doesn't just add stress, it lands on a weakened system that responds more severely than it would have in a healthy state. The feedback loops here are real. They are documented, and they accelerate in the direction of more vulnerability, not less. And there's one more thread to pull on here, one that reaches outside the atmosphere entirely, into territory that's speculative enough that I want to be careful about how I frame it, but intriguing enough that I'd be doing you a disservice to leave it out. The Sun is currently near the peak of solar cycle 25, which by some measures is tracking above initial predictions in terms of activity. Solar maximum, the period of highest solar activity within the roughly 11-year cycle, appears to be occurring approximately now or in the very near term. Elevated solar activity means more solar flares, more coronal mass ejections, and a more energetically active Sun delivering slightly more total irradiance to the Earth's upper atmosphere. The question of how solar activity influences surface climate is one that generates genuine scientific debate, and I want to be precise here. There is no strong evidence directly linking the current solar cycle to the specific heatwave event we've been discussing. The scientific consensus on this is clear. The primary drivers of the anomalies we're observing are atmospheric and oceanic. The heat dome, the jet stream behavior, the elevated background temperatures. These are products of Earth's climate system and the forcings operating within it. But the more speculative and genuinely interesting line of inquiry involves the interaction between solar activity and the upper atmosphere, specifically the stratosphere. There are mechanisms by which changes in UV irradiance during solar maximum can influence stratospheric temperature gradients, which in turn can affect the behavior of the polar vortex, which connects to jet stream variability in ways that aren't fully characterized. Stratospheric warming events, sudden, dramatic warmings in the polar stratosphere that propagate downward to affect surface weather, have been linked to some of the most persistent cold outbreaks and blocking events in the observational record. The relationship between solar activity and these events is an area of active research with some suggestive correlations, but not established causal mechanisms strong enough to include with confidence in operational forecasts. I'm raising it not as a driver of this event, but as a reminder that the Earth's climate system doesn't exist in isolation. It sits within an electromagnetic and energetic environment generated by the Sun, and our understanding of how that environment interacts with the lower atmosphere over the decadal timescale is genuinely incomplete. Science at the edges of understanding is often frustrating, precisely because the more you know, the more precisely you can describe what you still don't know. What happens in the next 90 days may be determined entirely by well-understood atmospheric mechanics. Or it may be shaped by interactions that we've observed but not yet fully explained. Either way, the trajectory of the next season is beginning to take shape, and it doesn't look like any spring in recent memory. The heat that is currently concentrated across the West is not going to stay there. Weather systems don't permanently park. Even the most persistent blocking patterns eventually break down. They shift, they weaken, they finally yield to the larger scale atmospheric flow. When this particular ridge begins to erode, the warm air it has been containing will spread eastward, and the central United States will be the next region to see temperatures and conditions that are out of place for the season. Forecasters are already watching the evolution of the pattern with exactly this concern. The transition zone, when it comes, is not simply a matter of temperatures returning to normal as the ridge exits. It's a matter of what happens when a massive dome of anomalously warm, dry air begins to collide with the colder, moister air masses that still exist east of the Rockies. Atmospheric instability is generated by contrast. When warm air meets cold air, when dry air meets moist air, the potential energy stored in those temperature and moisture gradients gets released as convection, as storms. The bigger the contrast, the more potential energy available, and the more extreme the convective events that can result. A heat wave spreading eastward from the Rockies into the Plain States doesn't just bring heat. It imports the thermodynamic potential for severe weather, for tornado outbreaks, for large hail events, for derecho-type windstorms, into a region that is, during April and May, already at its annual peak for severe weather activity. The overlap between an anomalous heat regime moving east and the severe weather season beginning to ramp up in the plains creates a volatility window that the Storm Prediction Center will be watching very carefully in the weeks ahead. And the most dangerous phase of that window is closer than most people realize. April through June is the period atmospheric scientists think about when they're trying to articulate what genuinely concerns them about the near-term trajectory of conditions across the central and eastern United States. The physics of it are straightforward even when the outcomes are not. Cold, dry air from Canada still descends into the northern plains during this period. Gulf of Mexico moisture, warm, humid air that is the fuel for the most violent thunderstorm systems in the world, begins flowing northward in earnest during this same window. In a normal year, those air masses clash along a relatively predictable geographic zone, producing severe weather that is intense but located in expected regions at expected times, with a character that experienced forecasters can anticipate and communicate. In a year where the western half of the country has been preheated to anomalous levels through an early and extreme heat wave, the thermodynamic contrast when those air masses finally encounter each other may be considerably larger than normal. Larger contrast means more energy. More energy means more extreme convective outcomes. Compound risks are what make the April through June window feel qualitatively different this year. You have drought conditions in the western tier expanding and intensifying. You have a wildfire risk that is already elevated and will only increase as temperatures remain above normal. You have agricultural stress arriving at a critical point in the growing season, and you have severe weather potential in the plains and Midwest that may be amplified by the same atmospheric conditions, driving all of the other hazards simultaneously. These are not sequential risks. They are concurrent risks, and managing them requires resources and attention that get competed for when multiple events are active in different regions at the same time. Forecasters have a phrase for this: stacked hazards, and this particular forecast season is shaping up to be one of the most stacked in recent years. While the storms will get the headlines when they come, the other threat is going to grow more quietly, and it will last longer. We've been talking about this event as if it is an anomaly, as if it belongs to the category of rare, shocking exceptions that punctuate an otherwise recognizable climate baseline. That framing is natural. It's how we've been conditioned to think about extreme weather. Something unusual happens. We measure it against the historical record. We find it extraordinary, and we wait for conditions to return to normal. But what if that's the wrong framework? What if the concept of returning to normal no longer maps onto the reality we're actually inhabiting? The more clarifying question isn't, how extreme is this event? The more clarifying question is this event the worst extreme we'll see? Or is it the mildest extreme we'll see going forward? Is this the ceiling, the awful high water mark that we'll look back on with relief when cooler conditions eventually return? Or is this the new floor, the baseline from which future anomalies will be measured? The data doesn't give us a comfortable answer to that question. Global average surface temperatures have been tracking above the previous record for an extended period. Ocean heat content is at record levels, including in the subsurface layers we discussed. Arctic sea ice extent continues its long-term decline. The atmospheric CO2 concentration continues to rise. Every one of these metrics represents a ratchet, a one-way change that raises the floor from which the next extreme event will launch. The records that are being broken this March were themselves set during periods that future generations may look back on as relatively temperate. The loss of historical reference points is something that doesn't get discussed enough in the mainstream conversation about climate change. For most of human civilization, the past was a reliable guide to the future. You could look at 100 years of weather records and build infrastructure, plan agriculture, design cities, and raise families with reasonable confidence that the range of conditions you'd face was bounded by the range of conditions your predecessors had faced. That confidence is being eroded. The past is becoming a progressively less accurate model of the present, and the present is becoming a progressively less accurate model of the future. The system is still evolving. The Pacific is still responding. The models are still running. And somewhere in a monitoring station in the Rockies, or on a buoy in the equatorial Pacific, a number is being recorded right now that will either confirm or revise everything I've just told you. What we know for certain is that the event currently unfolding is happening before El Niño, before the additional forcing that history tells us produces the most extreme global temperature anomalies. Which means the version of this with El Niño, if it develops, launches from a starting point that no previous El Niño has ever launched from.